We're going to go live here. Hey, everybody. Welcome. We are discussing, this is after the class, we are discussing the Torah portion Noah. And so I'm interested in some of your thoughts because I've already expressed some of mine, at least enough to stir people up, and so let's have us a good conversation. We have Todd and Angel. Hey, guys, Shabbat Shalom. How are you?
Shabbat Shalom, Ross. How you doing, buddy?
Man, I am doing wonderfully. How about you guys?
Pretty good. I'm going to give you a little commercial here, but a better half got for me.
Hey, look at that. Man, that is a good-looking shirt.
That's I don't know where I got it, but,
Hey, Seth designed that bad boy.
Pretty good.
I like it. Guns and Moses, if some of you didn't see that.
If I had that hat on, I kind of look like that guy a little bit.
I think you do. All right. Hey, thank you, Angel. I appreciate that. Your man looks, he's always looking good, but man, with that shirt on, I'm telling you, just perfect. All right, go ahead, Todd. I've already pumped you up. Be nice.
There you go. Well, once again, you got my brain going during the teaching, and one of the things that, like what Michael just brought up, but the clean and unclean. The question I have is, how would he know? Torah hadn't been written yet.
Mm-hmm.
So how would he know? Of course, people do argue, well, it's because he's always had it, from the beginning. But something that is interesting that I noticed when you were reading the two different versions is by doing that, it makes it sneakier to add things in. Such as if you read the Jehovah version, when he says that Noah looked out and the ground was dried. And all of a sudden, oh yeah, by the way, he sacrificed some animals. But yet, if you read the next Jehovah, that's a couple of pages afterwards, is when he talk about, and his sons exit the ark.
Yeah.
So to me, that flows. But if you have two different versions and you can kind of put something in there, just completely just out of whack. And to me, the whole thing about Noah doing the sacrifices just doesn't fit.
Let me ask you something on that then, Todd, because first thing is, and I everybody that knows me knows I want honest feedback. Was the explanation of the two sources helpful for you guys? Whether you agreed with it or not? But whether you agreed with it?
Yeah, the whole card thing was genius.
Did you even like the joke about the decks? You can be honest. I mean, that was.
Yeah.
I think when I said that, I think I saw Seth kind of roll his eyes, but But I do think that that's what happened. I do think we have these two, and I had read that for years. Honestly, I'd read that for years, but I never really embraced it because I thought, well, that's one way to think about it, but maybe we have these different structures, chiastic structure, maybe we have this, have that. And so I never really looked at it. But in fact, when I read the Richard Elliott Friedman does that very exercise, not the cards, but shows in his book the Genesis 6:5 through 8:22 with the different sources indicated. And whenever I really read it, and I read it this week, and I said, my God, man, that has got to be the case.
Yeah, I'll give you that one. That's,
now, you were asking something, though. You made a point that if once they're combined, were you suggesting that once they're combined, it becomes more likely that things might be added? Is that what you said?
Well,
makes it easier.
It makes it easier because it's if you've got two different versions of a story, then you can introduce something in the process, and I think that's what they're doing is they're introducing the acceptance of sacrifices. And I still go back to Cain and Abel because I think those sacrifices were reversed intentionally because it seems to me that he would be displeased with the killing of one of his creatures.
Yeah.
But he's okay with the vegetables and stuff like that was offered instead. Just to me, that seems like they were flip-flopped, and it's in order to accept sacrifices as a storyline. And I think that's what they did here with Noah.
Well, let me
Because
ask you this: if because full disclosure for those who are listening in, you are a vegan though, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, and I'm not being critical. I'm just saying, but if we approach the text, and I'm not saying you're wrong, but if we approach the text with that, is it possible? Let's say, let me explain it this way. Let's say we have on the Cain and Abel story, we have one source whose primary mission has always been to promote the sacrificial system. And then
Right.
we have another source who says, hey, God never wanted sacrifice. And then let's say, using my little silly illustration here, that the same process took place in that, okay? So bear with me and I'll try to make sense of what is in my head and it's not coming out my lips right. What I think, it could be that they're switched. Some have proposed that. But it could be that if you separate out the sources, you've got one version which goes along with, of course, God loved this because he's a sacrificial, he's appeased by the sweet smelling savor. I would encourage you to take that same thinking and go look at that story and see. Who is that? I don't know if you have this. This is not just a sales pitch. I'm just wondering if you have the. Let me look real quick. So
Are you talking about this?
You got it. You got it. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Good. Okay. So look at that story where they bring. Okay. All right. This is interesting. So the story is Jay. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
By the way, those who don't know where we're at, we're in Genesis chapter 4. And you can see that Jay's story begins actually further up, but we're just following it along. And it says, and the man knew his wife, so forth and so on. Verse 3, and in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought the fruit of the ground an offering unto Jehovah. And you go, okay, now, as a person who's studying these sources, forget the documentary hypothesis. I'm hearing people kind of frustrated, and they're putting things out, about, well, Ross is all into this documentary. Forget that term if that bothers you. It's a source that clearly is pro-sacrificial here.
Yeah.
But anyway, rather than just go on and on about it, the whole story with Cain being displeasing to God, with his sacrifice, and Abel's sacrifice being pleasing because it's the killing of an animal or whatever, that fits Jay.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And
Right.
if we go, well, wait a minute now, I thought that man's whole mission was to be a gardener. Nothing was ever said about killing animals. You're like, yeah, that's because the Bible begins with P, and priestly source isn't going to have sacrifice until Exodus 40.
Right. That is correct. And I agree with you on that one too. But it's just it's kind of like when you talk about the deck of cards.
Yeah.
And I was referring to the Noah doing the sacrifices or whatever. You can actually take that deck of cards, because I used to play poker at work all the time.
Right.
And that's kind of the same thing as having a card shoved in your sleeve, and you just kind of add it to your deck.
Yeah.
Same kind of thing. Nobody sees you do it. So I just think it's just kind of interesting that the story flows, except for that.
Yeah.
Because everything just kind of flows in there, and to me, that's an easy way to find something that seems out of whack.
Exactly. No, that's a good point. Once you look at it in the sources, a lot of questions really make a lot of the problems go away. Okay, so I use this all the time, but to me, it's one of the biggies. From the get-go, from Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, we get introduced to the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. And and from that point on, it's 7,000 some odd times in the Hebrew Bible. And so we're told, hey, look, God's known by the name Yod-Heh, Vav-Heh for forever, all the way from Genesis chapter 2, and then you get to Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, and it says, then men began to call upon the name of Jehovah. You're like, oh, wow, okay. Or Yehovah or Yahweh or Yahuwah or however someone wants to pronounce it, and they get their T-shirt and they're all happy because they know the name of God. And then then they get to Genesis chapter 6, and Bible scholars tell them, well, I know it sounds like it's saying that God wasn't known by that name, but we know that's not true because we have it all the way back in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. And the poor Bible student says, okay, I believe you, great one. Well, that's not true. We have different sources. And so once we realize that and we go, wait a minute, if you're looking at a particular source, we know that in Exodus chapter 6, if we look at the source, we go, well, prior to this, in that source, the name of God is never used. There you go. And it's the same with these other ideas. So why is it that we have some text in our Bible which seem to advocate and push for sacrifices, and we have others that say no? It's because we have multiple ancient sources that come from different perspectives.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Bible student, because we were told by our last preacher that in seminary you're not allowed to ask questions.
Yeah.
You're to take it with a spoon and eat it up.
It's pretty much like any college or higher institution of learning. You have to, you're told to regurgitate what you hear.
Mm-hmm. Yep. You can have individual thoughts, but if you put them on that paper, you're going to get a red X, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't survive in that class.
No, but the beautiful thing is that we can really, if we're honest to Moses, if we're honest to the text, we're going to see some wonderful things in this study. And look, I know this is often said by me, but people don't have to agree with me. They really don't. I prefer when people have ideas that challenge, that they bring those forward and say, hey, I'm thinking about what you said. I consider it, but I don't agree because of this, this, and this. And that's partly because I've come to accept that if my faith and what I believe is not willing and able to stand up to a challenge, it's certainly not one that I want to embrace and try to live my life by, right?
Yeah. But as far as the localized flood or however, I think it was everything, but it's just interesting that on mountain ranges all over the world, that there are aquatic fossils on these mountain ranges. Now, why would that be?
Yeah.
That's why I think it was the everything. But
a global.
Everything. So it was. I just throwing that out there. But yeah, you definitely got the little brain kicking into gear during that teaching. That was. I don't know why I do that, but I do.
Hey, well, I just want to say one more time, that's a good-looking shirt. I was going to, Seth designs these things, and then I have to figure out what I can get, so I think I like that color, too.
So is there a theory of the Guns and Moses? I mean, or is it just a play on words?
It is kind of a play on words. An old rocker like me, I've heard other people. I actually saw something very similar in Jerusalem, and then Jono Vandor and I did a discussion. There was a big debate on one of our previous episodes, and Jono and I sometimes wade into all kind of stuff in our, Well, anyway, this particular thing was on gun legislation, and Australia has certain rules, and I live in Louisiana. We don't have what they have, and so it came up, and we decided to do a class on Guns and Moses. I used that title because I was inspired by the thing I saw in Jerusalem. And then, long story short, Seth designed what is now on your shirt as the thumbnail. And so when we were talking about putting the store together, he said, I've got some cool stuff that would work well for T-shirts and things like that. So it sort of resurrected that thumbnail on the shirt. So no, I'm glad to see it. Really, it looks good.
I think it's cool.
Yeah. All right.
That's all I got.
Good. Well, stick around. I'm sure you'll have some other good stuff. I'm going to get Karen up, and then I'm going to pick up a couple of our YouTube comments. Hey, Karen, how are you?
Good. How's my audio? Can you hear me?
I hear you perfectly. Sounds good.
I was just going to say, I've read a lot of origin stories and things like that. One of the things that separates the Hebrew text from a lot of the Sumerian or the Greek or, whoever it is you're looking at, is the table of nations. It's what happens after the flood.
Yeah.
In many texts, the Noah character, he goes to heaven and he joins the gods and there is no record of his sons.
Yeah.
But in the Hebrew text, there's a genealogy. And I honestly think that is one of the main reasons why the Hebrew text has survived. And, it's a copy of a copy of a copy, but that's really all we have for a lot of things anyway.
Right.
It's easier to remember stories that happened during a certain ancestor's lifetime.
Right.
So if you're just, keeping track of the things that happened to the people in your family tree, I think it's a lot easier to pass down. Because people want to hear the story of us.
Mm-hmm.
And that, whether it's the priestly author or the Yahwist, they're telling the story of us.
Right.
And, whether it's 100% true or not, I don't really think about that much, but, it's a pretty good record. It helps them organize and keep track of things. Because there's what they call it, the table of nations.
Yeah. Yeah. Genesis 10, right? You're thinking about.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't see that in almost any other, what you can call it, from cuneiform to Babylonian or whatever, you just don't see that. And I think that's important to remember. And then the Sumerian arc was round, not rectangle.
Right. Now, you, as someone who's looked at these other stories, though, it is interesting, to say the least, that we have, and it's not just this story, we have other ancient stories that we find sort of maybe not total match, but we certainly find, Utnap Pishtim, and, we have these various heroes, and, if you squint, you can go, oh, that's this is the Babylonian or the Sumerian account, and this is our hero. So I think a lot of times there's a little bit of, and so some would say, well, that clearly the Bible is borrowing from that version or vice versa. I mean, people put forward different theories, and I think many of us have read a lot of these accounts. That's the fun thing about this group, is we're not dealing with people who've never heard of these other accounts. I mean, no one in here is probably surprised about the Epic of Gilgamesh. Many of us have read those stories. But what is interesting is that we do have these stories, even though they're different in their details, we do have these stories from various different groups, and I'm fascinated to read these. And some of them seem crazy. A lot of the other ancient stories are the gods are upset because it's just too loud, and
Right.
As a parent, I've experienced that, where you're just like, oh my God, man. But anyway, it's a little bit crazy, but there's still some fun reading there.
Yeah. And when I see them put in there, the land is cursed and maybe they're having a drought.
Yeah.
And it's cursed. I mean, maybe they're having a dust bowl. Maybe they're, some kind of weather pattern that they are associating with behavior or.
Yep. Yep. And we do have this flood story certainly has survived in quite a few of the ancient sources. So, and again, comparative religious studies is fun stuff because you can kind of see. I think that a lot of the guesswork as to which came first is simply that, but it's still fun to read through. So,
And I don't argue about which came first. I mean, clearly there's an event happened. There's some shared knowledge in all different cultures. But there's just so little paperwork for many other different cultures.
yep.
What separates Israel, if you will, or from a lot of the other stories is there's a paperwork, there's a paper trail. They left records. And other cultures did leave records as well, but they're just not quite as extensive, I would say. You find it, you're trying to piece, you got bits and pieces and you're trying to put them together.
Yep.
And they did it for you here in this one.
Right. Yep. Well, and it's fun. I think we're going to see more and more of this too, is between what we're doing on Thursday nights with Jonah and I when we do our Torah Pearls. We're going to get into some of these things and throw out some different other ancient stories and narratives, and what we're doing here on Saturday mornings. I think each week the package, the Torah Pearls and the Saturday classes are going to open up quite a bit in terms of pulling back the veil on some of these old stories. But again, those of you who research, and I know, Karen, you do a lot of research on your own as well, don't forget, share some of the things as you think about it, with the others in the group, like on Discord or whatever. I mean, that's the only way we get that going. But I want people to be exposed to all these different stories, and sometimes we can come up with some pretty good stuff to engage others in. So,
yeah, I'm still going through. This is kind of a deep read, but this is my one I'm doing right now.
What's it called?
Stories of Origins in the Bible and Ancient Mediterranean Literature, and it's comparing the Table of Nations to the Book of Women, which is something in the Greek records.
Who's the author or the editor of that?
Guy Darshan. He's at the Hebrew University.
Okay. All right.
Pretty good.
That sounds like something fun to read there. Good deal. What else, Karen?
I think that's it for now.
Well, sit in the wings, and as you think of something, jump in.
Later on Noah story, but we'll save it for next week.
Hey, either that or just come back in later. Good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
All right, look, I'm going to bring Damon up. 1 second, Damon. Let me just say, I see a bunch of comments. One thing I wanted to pull up is Tom Davis said, Ross's sharing the remix of Jay Flood's story and P's flood story was great. Since reading Friedman's Who Wrote the Bible, I have tried to find a book of a Torah-wide remix. Does anyone know of such a book? I'm not sure I know what you mean by remix, but if you mean a book that exposes the sources throughout, there is that. Let me know if that's what you're looking for. And or if you're looking for something like what we did in the Genesis Torah tablet, we're going to put out Exodus. It's already done. Leviticus, it's already done. Numbers is already done. I'm almost finished with Deuteronomy. But we're going to release those as we work through the annual cycle of readings this year. And then my end goal would be to publish all of those together, Genesis through Deuteronomy, as a Pentateuch with the sources and everything else we have, the annual, the triennial cycle of readings and so forth. And that's the base text that I'm using for my commentary project that I'm working on. So, that's the goal, longer term. But so anyway, I'll check back in a minute and see if Tom has answered that. Okay, Damon, how are you, brother? Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Man, wild ride this morning.
All right. Wild ride in the class, or you've been out wild riding somewhere else?
No, wild ride in the class.
Okay. All right.
You got some good stuff here. But anyway, rather than comment directly on that, because there are a lot of peripheral issues that are coming in here that are also really, really interesting. I did have a couple of comments on the actual sources, but I want to come back to that.
Okay.
Karen had mentioned something interesting. She mentioned that in um, other sources, the arc is actually round. Karen, I just posted an article in the chat that mentions that, yeah, not only is the arc round in other sources, but if you read the dimensions right, in Genesis, it's actually talking about a round arc there too. So I figured you might be interested in that.
Hey, yeah, post that too, if you don't mind, Damon. If you just post that you're talking about, that article on the Discord.
Sure.
If you don't mind. Thank you. All right.
Yeah, I saw that several months ago and thought that was really interesting.
Okay.
So a few other things, one of which is, and Carrot had briefly touched on this, it's, we have these other stories and it's like they're similar. They're definitely similar. There are a lot of differences too, but it's like, okay, well, what do they mean and how do we know? And there's just not a lot of detail written. So I want to present a line of thought that I've been kind of working on for quite a while now to try to delve down to how we can start to figure out, okay, well, what does it mean? What were they trying to tell us? And that is by first backtracking, looking at the Tower of Babel story in Genesis 11, which I feel we can strongly tie to the Ur-3 period of Sumer, that's circa 2100 to 2000 BC. There are a lot of connections there. I don't want to get into them here. I've done that in the dialogue section.
Mm-hmm.
But if we use that as a basis to figure out, okay, well, what about the flood? What about the Table of Nations? What is that telling us? I think we can actually learn a lot. One is that at the end of Genesis 10, it tells us, okay, this is how the nations were divided. Okay, this is basically, as far as I understand it, like land grants to all the nations. If you look at Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 and 9, this is how the nations were divided. And I think we've mentioned this before. Michael Heiser views that passage as talking about land grants, that all of these different nations were getting their own places to live. Okay. Why would we need to establish land grants vis-a-vis the flood? Because I think what the flood is telling us is that this is the primordial chaos out of which those nations were formed. Just like we have primordial chaos at the beginning of Genesis 1, we have the flood. It's basically another primordial chaos out of which all of these nations sprung. That being said, according to the genealogy, we're only a few hundred years between the Tower of Babel and the flood, supposedly. And if that would be roughly 2300 BC, that's after these nations are actually founded. Egypt goes back to like 3000 BC. So I don't think this is saying that these are the foundation of those nations. I think what this is telling us is that the sons of Noah intermarried with these nations that already existed, and that the flood was not meant to be literal, not there, and not in the Epic of Gilgamesh either. So I just wanted to toss that out there. I don't think that it's supposed to be taken literally. I think it means something else. I think it's actually talking about a flood of armies. I'll go ahead and break there.
Okay. So that's just, I know that this is obvious. That's an interpretation, your interpretation based on what you read, that none of these tales are even talking about a literal flood in the sense of water rising and destroying all flesh or anything of that nature.
Not global. There may have been a local flood, but definitely not a global one, because there were people around before 2300 BC.
Okay. All right. All right, then. What else, Brother Damon? You going to take a break and jump back in as you feel inspired?
Yeah, I think that that was the main thing that I wanted to present. Oh, there was one other question that I forget who asked me in the class chat. They said, please bring this up. And that was um, when you brought up about the Watchers,
Okay.
the sons of God marrying the daughters of men. And what I see there is a chiastic structure spanning from Genesis 4:26 to Genesis 6:2, starting off with, then men began to call themselves by the name of the Lord, YHVH, and ending with, the sons of God saw the daughters of men who were fair, they took to themselves wives of all whom they chose. What I think is the sons of God in Genesis 6:1 and 2 are the same as the ones calling themselves by the name of the Lord in Genesis 4:26. They're the descendants of Seth in the middle of that chiastic structure. So rather than being watchers, I think watchers was a later interpretation.
All right. All right. Yeah. There's a lot in some of these stories. I think for me, it's becoming more and more consistent as I look at whether or not someone embraces the documentary hypothesis in all or in part. We see certain structures and structural elements in these ancient books, which really bring out, I think, a lot more detail than people have noticed in the past. So I think that anytime we can look at those ancient underlying structures and find familiarity of terms, similarity of terms between one text and the next, and if that brackets itself within the larger story, I think that's all very interesting to consider. All right.
Someone just asked a question, why a partial flood but not a global flood? Well, if you look back over the past 10,000 years ago, we haven't had a global flood. We have generations of humans going back that we can trace back at least beyond 4000 BC. You can look over into ancient Egypt, goes back to 3000 BC. There were people living there for several hundred years before that, pre-dynastic Egypt. Prior to that, the Sahara was a savanna, a grassland, and we have rock art all over the Sahara from when people were living there before it dried out. This was when there was actually heavy rainfall in the area. There was an oasis in southwestern Egypt called Nabta Playa, where people would visit and bring their cattle, and they would bring them there for part of the year, and then the oasis would dry up. They would leave and come back again the next year. From the amount of remains that have been excavated there, people have been living there for thousands of years. So 3500 BC minus thousands of years is well before the time of Adam and Eve. If we have not only that, but also no interruption in the recorded history of Egypt, then we can't be talking about a flood anytime before, say, like 8 or 9,000 BC.
Let me just add one other thing to that, just so we can get other people. But I was going to say, to your point, one of the biggest debates as to whether it was local or global or whatever is it simply hinges on a word, whether or not Eretz is land or earth. That's where this really comes down to. I mean, it's how do you translate that? So is it a local flood or and the question becomes, are the biblical writers describing something that impacted the whole earth? Well, the whole earth as far as they were concerned, very likely. But, was it, 15 cubits above Mount Everest? Then I think that's one of the bigger points. But anyway, so there's a lot of debate about that, and we can certainly dive more into that in the dialogue. And Damon, I just publicly, I appreciate, I know you put a lot of time into sharing some of your thoughts on that. It goes without saying that not everyone has to agree on all of those things that are posted, yours, mine, anyone's. But it does help us to get in and engage with others in the text. And I think that's a good thing. So I appreciate you on that.
Sure. All right. Passing the baton.
All right, brother. Thank you, man. And Eric, how are you, my brother?
Doing well with that little rain we got finally.
Wasn't that sweet?
Boy. And my neighbors, well, they're maybe 6 miles away.
Yeah.
They had 9 inches, Ross.
Wow.
Totally flooded the whole area. Just amazing how spotty it was. Anyway, my question kind of is in the muddled brain of 70 something years, putting Dr. Schroeder's timeline, if you will, in conjunction with the standard, if you will, religious looking timeline of the Bible. If the flood came before the Tower of Babel, and you consider that the only people that the Bible is talking about are God's people, not the other humans or soon to be humans in evolution, it seemed like God's people were sent out from the Tower of Babel all over the earth. And of course, all the other flood stories would come from the original one. Or is that just too simplistic?
Well, I'm not going to say it's too simplistic. I'm all ears, man. I'm considering. There is, by the way, let me just say, you know, you've got one view of these texts where you say, okay, well, we have different, maybe potentially, my view that I have become to really lean heavily towards is that we do have these different sources that make up the text, and certainly within that, you have some very ancient stories which have clearly been passed on and maybe altered slightly throughout time. We see traces of them in other epics of other people. But even within the Hebrew Bible, I've seen some pretty, let's just say, interesting approaches to the text. Why do we have and this is apart from any documentary or source criticism.
Right,
This is
yeah,
just
yeah.
someone looking at the text and going, well, you know, in this
Yeah.
particular text, man is referred to as Adam, but here it's Ish, and here it's Gibor, and here. So maybe there are different species, you know, like instead of Homo sapiens, maybe one is describing that, and maybe another term is used for, you know, another branch. I don't know. That's not necessarily my field or my interest, but I have seen that. So then, you know, your theory of, well, what we have in the Hebrew Bible is the story of this one group.
Yes.
And maybe a little bit of their interaction with some of the others. I don't know.
Right. And looking at that with Dr. Schroeder's comment on, you know, there were two, if you will, creations of mankind, and a few other items that are in his books. It really interests me to think of it in that overall, you know, like you said, opposed to all these other looking at dates that history says it is, and maybe there are even people that'll argue that it doesn't say that in the geological record, and this, that, and the other, it all come. But just overall, if the flood came first, and then the tower, and then humans, as in God's people, Adam's descendants, as opposed to the others, it would also explain men of renown marrying sons of God, i.e., sons of men is the men, humans created first, and then Adam's sons are sons of God because they are Jehovah's people. Anyway, that's where.
Yeah, I follow what you're saying, and that is one of the views. Some view that these sons of God are, let's say, the godly line, you know, and so they're not like literally like God's kids, but but there are other ancient stories where these are not just like, regular guys. These are just like it looks like it reads in the text. And a lot of the ancient views are literally thought to be in that sense. And it's not something that we can just dismiss and think, not that you are, but I'm saying sometimes I read or I hear people say, well, they didn't actually believe that. Oh, yeah, they did. Yeah, and a lot of the ancient world believed that you have an intermingling of the heavenly host with the beautiful women,
Right.
whether you're talking about this particular
Correct.
pantheon or
But
see,
but
yeah,
where do those come from in my looking at it, and not deeply scholarship?
yeah,
That all came after Babylon when they commingled with all the pagan idolatry in Babylon.
mm,
All these angels and all these great mythical beings and all the other stuff that Judaism and Christianity have built out of Babylon, which is the same as Babel in my
mm-hmm.
view. And of course it gets confused, but could there be a basic story that really is Adam, the flood, and the Tower of Babel first, and everything else came after that?
Yeah. That's it. This is good
Anyway,
stuff. No, I mean, what else would we spend our time thinking about, Eric? I mean, this is the good stuff. I feel sorry for people who don't just spend every waking minute wrestling with things like we're talking about now.
it always has something else, and for sci-fi fans, which I am,
Yeah.
uh, it it just shows it goes backwards and forwards.
Yep. Good
All right,
stuff.
that's it. That's
All
it.
right. All right, Eric. Well, hang around. You may have something else strike you. Now, I'm going to get Todd and Angel up, but 1 second. I'm way behind on comments, but that's okay. Most of you are answering each other's comments, but I did want to make a point. Someone asked, because I talked about the Genesis, they said, well, what? I looked for it. Excuse me. I looked for it and couldn't find it on Amazon. It's not on Amazon. We have it in our own store. And it's horebinstitute.com. And Seth uploaded it. He found a publisher that he liked better, and we're happy with that. And so it's there on our store. It's not in Kindle. We could do that. We could put it in Kindle, but the whole purpose of it is we want people to interact with the text and use it to take notes. So it's got one page of text and then a facing page where you can take notes. And our idea is that it becomes a notebook, and you use that like in your own study, or if you're following along on Saturday, you can say, this crazy guy talked about such and such, and here's where he's wrong. Whatever you want to put on there. It's your side. We have the Bible side, and then we have your side. All right, Todd, Angel, I'm ready.
The comment that was made earlier about where the sons of Seth called themselves Yahovah in 426.
Yeah,
That's not what it says.
I got you.
It says they then began men to call upon the name of Yahovah.
Yeah.
The whole Seth and sons of God thing, that's seminary. That's what they teach in seminary, because I guess they don't want you thinking. But Enoch goes into vivid detail on how this happened.
Yeah.
And as far as the Father wanting to destroy because of everybody's actions, it just kind of makes me wonder, how bad did it really get? I mean, because if the angels were teaching warfare and cosmetics and all this other stuff, who knows how far it got? I mean, I would love to know what kind of technology was around then.
Yeah.
Who knows? I mean, it's just kind of crazy. And then after the flood, everything kind of goes back to basics, horse and buggy or whatever, It's hard to tell how far they got, and it kind of makes you wonder if the animals were involved too.
Yeah.
I mean, who said they might have been crossbreeding animals or something. I mean, who knows? None of us know. But yeah, so I just want to make a point that is not what 426 says.
I got you. All right.
So
Yeah, and I've always read it the way you're talking about it. It's at some point the writer, obviously here in this case, is making it very clear that it's at this point that men began to call upon the name Yod Hey Vav Hey, and so that's why I've always thought about. I mean, it's very clear in the Hebrew and in the English as well, at least as far as I'm concerned. Hey, good stuff. Okay, before I get Nadine up, we're going to tell our YouTube audience Shabbat Shalom. And just want to let you all know that we appreciate you joining us. We're going to be continuing on with our Yachad group, and just to give them some time to say thank you for helping support everything we do. Look, join us Thursday night. So you'll see us with Jono and I. Will be back Thursday night, and we'll be doing our episode 3. We're talking about Torah portion Lech Lecha. And then the following next week on Saturday, we'll be doing our class on Lech Lecha. So if you're on YouTube and you're part of the Yachad, come on over to the Zoom. That's where we're going to be. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.